the issue of trade has been in the news a lot lately with the tariff questions and doomsaying about Donald Trump's claims or professions of trade war against China, which of course he's doing more than just professing. And recently, David Dayen wrote an excellent piece about that issue, and so I thought, let's have him on the show again. He's been on the show before. Dave Dayen is a fellow with In These Times. He's a contributor to The Intercept, and he's the author of the book Chain of Title, an excellent book about the foreclosure crisis that won the Studs and Ida Turkel Prize. And his recent piece on, I'm going to get the title, I'm determined to get the title, in the New Republic, was The Inevitable Death of Global Trade as We Know It. So first of all, David Dayen, thanks for coming back on the program.
Always a pleasure to be here. Thanks.
And secondly, I don't want to summarize, I could, but I don't want to summarize your piece. I did read it, so I could take a stab at it. But basically, how would you state your thesis as you put it here in the New Republic?
Well, sure. So we have, kind of been overshadowed in terms of discussion of trade with all these talk about tariffs and trade war, and there's somewhat less of an emphasis on how we got here. And how we got here is that over the last couple decades, America has lost something like 5 million manufacturing jobs. And this was done kind of in a almost deliberate fashion, where China was let into the WTO and other countries were encouraged to compete with U.S. workers, and not much was really given to the U.S. workers who were displaced, the losers from global trade, which don't get talked about as much as the winners, and not much was done for these people. So it was kind of inevitable that we were going to have a situation where someone was going to raise a ruckus about this, that there was some demagogue out there, or some just progressive member of politics talking about trade, who was going to rile up people who felt like that the global trade agenda works for a few large multinational corporations and doesn't work for the majority of the American people.
Yeah, you quoted Jared Bernstein, the economist, and Lori Wallach, who works in the trade area, as saying the hollowness of the false promises, meaning of all these deals, is finally evident to everyone now, basically. And they say the rules must be written for all the cars on the road, not just the Lamborghinis, which is a good line. I kind of wish I'd written it. But I guess one of the great points I thought you made here, Dave Dayen, is that there's this kind of shared belief among a lot of decision makers and influential media people that we had, until Trump came along, a stable global trade order, that it was clicking along. Yeah, okay, some jobs were lost, but somehow things would have been fine if this fanatic and granted, Trump is fanatical, but on many issues, but that if Donald Trump hadn't come along, we would have been fine. And the point that you were making is that when you have such a devastating impact for millions of workers who lost their jobs, presumably millions of others who lost jobs as a result of the loss of manufacturing, the indirect unemployment that was also caused, wage weakening as a result, all of the things that are hurting the middle class, that you have your point, and I think it's an excellent one, is that here in the U.S. and in other countries as well, that creates instability. And the takeaway for me, one of the takeaways was, if that's not met with a progressive trade agenda, you're opening the door for a demagogue like Trump to step in, and for other demagogues in other parts of the world to step in as well, presumably, right?
That's absolutely right. It's actually a dangerous policy to ignore the consequences and implications of moving millions and millions of manufacturing jobs out of the United States, which hasn't, by the way, really improved the lives of the working class in these countries to which these jobs have been imported. I mean, you only have to look at something like the Rana Plaza disaster in Sri Lanka, where an entire factory came down crashing upon the workers. Or you look at something like Foxconn, where they have to put up nets to catch potential suicide victims from jumping out of the building. To know that this policy works for a small set of elites and does not work for the working class broadly, not just in the United States, but all around the world. And it's really dangerous to ignore those implications, because inevitably it's going to lead to someone like a Trump, especially if progressives don't have a policy other than restoring an order that wasn't working for a whole lot of people.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point. I mean, I think Rana Plaza was Bangladesh, wasn't it? But either way, you know, throughout the third world, the developing world, you know, basically what gets said to progressives who bring up this issue sometimes in democratic circles is, well, don't you care about improving the lives of people in Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or other parts of the world, as if somehow it is incumbent on working people in developed countries to bear the brunt for the profitability of the corporations. And I thought you also made an excellent point, but what these corporations are bringing to these countries is not that great. So I guess to say the least, it often involves slave labor. You mentioned the suicide nets at Foxconn. There are also the horrific burnings to death and so on that have taken place in those China Foxconn factories among workers building our iPhones, among other things. So I guess then my question for you, David Dayen, would be, what do we do? Because here's the thing, before we even get to the solution, here's the thing that I think we're struggling with now. Those of us who see problems with these trade agreements and have been fighting the sort of bipartisan consensus behind them for some time, now we have an added problem. Because Donald Trump, in his sort of flailing and episodic and odd way, is at least rhetorically attacking them. So now not only are we fighting, it feels to me, but I'm curious your thoughts, now we're not only fighting this sort of consensus, but we're also being accused of saying, well, Trump is sort of right about something, or at least not completely wrong. And it seems to me that people are using this as an opportunity to equate the resistance with reinforcing the global trade system that's hurting so many workers. Do you get what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I think that is a danger, and I think that's why I wrote the story. I think that the proper way to go about this is to say that Donald Trump identified a very real problem, which was a set of trade agreements and an entire architecture around global trade that is done for the benefit of very few corporations and elite interests. What we can also say is that his solutions for this problem aren't working. I think it's pretty clear that they are creating some self-inflicted harms. We haven't seen that fully realized within sort of the economy in aggregate, but in pockets you can certainly see that farmers are being harmed, that people who make large manufacturing here still in the United States have to get their component parts, which are costing a lot more. I talked to someone who is a caterer who uses a lot of aluminum pans, and you know, she's got increased costs. So we can sort of separate it about between identifying this problem and looking at the solution that Trump has put about, which is to use these tariffs as threats to bring people to the negotiating table, but with very incoherent ideas about what he wants to get out of those negotiations. And we can say that there's a better way, and that better way is rooted in raising, I believe, global standards for labor, for the environment, all over the world, so that would cut off sort of this need and desire and obsession, really, to outsource these kinds of manufacturing impulses. And, that's just one way you can think about it. Also bringing workers into the conversation and giving them the ability to enforce these rights if you give them to them in trade agreements, enforce labor standards, enforce environmental standards, and give even the ability to sue companies who are outsourcing this management of manufacturing to other countries and smaller companies within other countries to actually go after the parent, the corporate parent. Like in Rana Plaza, it wasn't the company that owned that facility that was making money off the goods. It was Walmart and companies multinationals who were using the owners of Rana Plaza as a subcontractor. So that's my example there. So I think there's a way to describe this, but it can't just be we want to reverse Trump and return to a status quo that was so inadequate that it created almost a bipartisan position against the trade agenda as it stood in 2016.
Well, it created a bipartisan, I assume you mean among voters.
Certainly among voters, but even, Hillary Clinton said she wouldn't vote for the TPP. There was a very strong, most Democrats in Congress said they were not interested in voting for the Trans-Pacific Partnership because it didn't have adequate safeguards to make it not just a corporate giveaway. And so I think there's a way to separate those 2 points. They are in tension, as you aptly describe, but I think there's a way to discuss it in a way that it allows for some nuance.
And I agree with you. And I think as we go over some of the solutions that you mentioned, it's important to note that the trade agreements so far have included this ISDS, as it's called, this dispute resolution process, sort of extra non-state court system where private corporations have much more standing than ordinary citizens do. And in fact, there was a study showing that private corporations, the larger the corporation, the more likely they were to prevail in those hearings and so on. So some sort of more just resolution process, some voice for workers. You mentioned raising the living standards and working conditions of people around the world. There's lip service to that in the deals that have been passed in the past, but nevertheless, when there's even child slave labor going on, even a Democratic administration like President Obama's can tend to downgrade that problem in order to try to push a deal through. I'm trying to remember, was it Malaysia or one of those?
Yes.
So we really, it seems to me it all comes back to, if we're going to shift that, the TPP opposition that you described, certainly Hillary Clinton reversed her position on that. A number of Democratic politicians opposed it. The head of the Republican ticket opposed it, the now President Trump. That was driven by public opinion. So does that mean that we need to do more to educate the public and keep that pressure on?
I mean, I think the public gets it. They were the ones that opposition to the global trade agenda as it stood in 2016 was very bottom up. It was people, particularly who have been affected by the loss of manufacturing, by outsourcing. They understand that these deals aren't written with their interests in mind. And so it's dangerous to just knee-jerk respond to whatever it is Trump's doing by saying we need to restore this agenda that was roundly criticized by the public and recognized as just sort of a corporate kind of wish list, a way for elites to go around the legislative process and sometimes to go around sovereignty to place things into trade deals they couldn't otherwise get. That's still happening to a degree within the Trump administration. They're negotiating NAFTA right now, and there are giveaways to the tech industry. There are giveaways to regarding food safety that would degrade labeling, various other matters, getting labels off of high sugar content soda and junk food, and making sure those couldn't be labeled as harmful in any way. So in some ways, Trump represents sort of a break with this sort of standard of the global trade agenda. In other ways, he represents a very much a continuation of it. And I think that should be emphasized when you're talking about a progressive response to trade. We should emphasize where Trump has really just sort of carried water for corporate interests within, the main trade deal that he's negotiating right now, which is NAFTA, and describe how that should change and how these trade deals have to operate for the common good and not just the good of a few select companies.
And I think you made the point earlier, and it's worth reiterating, implicitly anyway, and I think it's worth reiterating before we go, that given the closeness of the 2016 election, it's impossible not to believe that this wrong-headed consensus about global trade actually gave us Donald Trump as a president. So unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But David Dayen, author of Chain of Title and fellow at In These Times, thanks for writing a great piece, really clear piece. I encourage people to read it. And thanks for coming back on the program.
Thanks for having me on.